In the middle of the night on October 24, 1944, just after midnight, with low rain clouds hanging over Leyte Gulf and the air so wet that canvas, steel, and skin all seemed to breathe the same feverish heat, the light cruiser United States ship Nashville lay at anchor off Tacloban, while the short-range radios crackled with out rest and faint flashes pulsed on the southern horizon, where Surigao Strait waited in darkness. The men on watch could hear the urgency in every voice, but what they could not yet see was the full shape of the trap the Japanese high command believed it had finally closed. Beyond those black waters sat the crowded American anchorage, transports, landing ships, ammunition, fuel, bulldozers, rations, field guns, spare tires, radio sets, engineers, medics, signal troops, and the long-hanging cargo nets that had been lowering the weight of an industrial republic onto the beaches for days. That cargo net, plain rope, swaying over black water, was the real object at stake that night, more than any admiral's vanity, more than any speech, more even than the fame of great battleships. If the Japanese could rip open Leyte Gulf before dawn, those nets would stop moving. The invasion would stiffen, starve, and bleed on the sand. That was the calculation in Tokyo and in the minds of the admirals sent to break MacArthur's return. The strange truth is that what MacArthur did when that trap seemed shut was not theatrical. He did not seize a headset and direct a sea battle like a man in a poster. He did something colder, quieter, and in its own way more revealing. He stayed with the beachhead as long as he could, then stepped off the cruiser the moment it was urgently needed elsewhere, clearing one more hull for the defense of the anchorage, while the whole American machine, escorts, radios, torpedo attacks, old battle wagons, submarines, carrier planes, and those patient cargo nets kept the invasion alive. To understand why that mattered, you have to begin before the first gun flashed in Surigao, back when Leyte was still an argument on a map and not yet a battlefield. The return to the Philippines had not moved forward only on courage. It moved on information. MacArthur had a wide guerrilla network across the islands, thousands of Filipinos and at least 50 radios feeding his headquarters a steady stream of reports on roads, garrisons, coastal defenses, shipping, and air activity. In September, American carrier strikes and reconnaissance in force found Japanese air strength weaker than expected. That discovery did not simply cheer planners. It changed the calendar. The Leyte operation, King II, came forward by roughly 2 months. That is how campaigns are sometimes decided, not by a shout, but by a penciled date moved closer because reconnaissance has quietly stripped away illusion. The Japanese still had ships, guns, and resolve, but they were already beginning to fight on a timetable set by American reach. For Admiral Soemu Toyota and the Imperial Navy, Leyte could not be treated as another island to be yielded after token resistance. The Philippines sat astride Japan's sea lifeline to the south. Oil, raw materials, and the last hopes of strategic endurance ran through those waters. If MacArthur planted himself there in strength, Japan would be cut in two. So Toyota unleashed Sho-Go, Victory Operation 1, the defense of the Philippines, a plan as elaborate as it was desperate. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would lead the main striking force through the Sibuyan Sea and down through San Bernardino Strait to fall on Leyte from the north. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, followed by Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima, would push in from the south through Surigao Strait. Land-based aircraft from Luzon would add weight from above. And far to the north, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would sail with a decoy carrier force, not to win a classic carrier battle, but to die if necessary while drawing Admiral William Halsey and the fast carriers away from the invasion. It was a trap built on Japanese faith in the decisive battle. Faith in converging steel. Faith that one clean operational stroke could crush an army in the middle of landing and strand MacArthur on a beach he had sworn to reclaim. On paper, it had a severe beauty. From the south, from the north, and from the air, the Americans would be compressed in the Gulf and smashed among their own transports. Yet from the American side, there was already a flaw as dangerous as any enemy squadron. There was no unified command. MacArthur commanded the invasion and the 7th Fleet under Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid. But Halsey's Third Fleet remained outside MacArthur's authority and reported to Admiral Chester Nimitz. MacArthur had wanted all of it under one hand. He did not get it. The Joint Chiefs kept two commands in the Pacific for reasons of politics, personality, and institutional habit. And when fleets are divided on paper, they can become divided in motion. Halsey's orders included support for the Leyte landings, but they also contained a fateful clause. If the chance arose to destroy a major part of the enemy fleet, that destruction became the primary task. In staff language, the sentence was neat. In battle, it became a door the Japanese intended to open. On October 20th, 1944, the door to the Philippines opened first for the Americans. MacArthur's forces went ashore on Leyte with more than 700 ships under Kinkaid supporting the operation. Halsey's covering force was immense as well, with Task Force 38 alone bringing 17 aircraft carriers, 6 fast battleships, and a cloud of escorts. 4 divisions of 6th Army landed on the East Coast. The assault was the visible face of return, the image remembered in newsreels, MacArthur wading through the surf, then speaking to the Filipinos as if a promise had crossed the sea in human form. But even on that first day, the Japanese reminded the anchorage that the battle would not be ceremonial. A Japanese torpedo plane hit the light cruiser Honolulu. The next day, a Japanese aircraft deliberately crashed into the Australian cruiser Australia. The great naval duel, usually remembered for giant guns and carriers, also contained these early hints of a new ugliness, men willing to convert the airplane itself into a projectile. Still, the landings went in. Still, the cargo nets swayed. Still, crates came down into boats and onto beaches. What the Japanese had to destroy was not one flagship or one general. It was momentum. The first heavy blow against Sho-Go came from beneath the sea. Before dawn on October 23rd, American submarines found Kurita's force. Bream damaged the heavy cruiser Aoba. Darter torpedoed Atego, Kurita's flagship. Dace hit Maya. In a few minutes, the center force lost 2 heavy cruisers sunk and another damaged, and Kurita himself had to survive the wreck of his flagship and shift the burden of command forward in the middle of an operation already built on precise timing. To a lesser navy, that might have been enough to break the attack. It was not enough here. Kurita continued. The next day, in the Sibuyan Sea, American carrier aircraft attacked again and again. The giant battleship Musashi absorbed punishment on a scale that still reads like metallurgy turned into agony. She was eventually sunk, and from American cockpits the results looked decisive, too decisive in fact. Pilot reports were dangerously optimistic. Halsey came to believe Kurita had been so battered that whatever survived no longer posed a grave threat. At the same time, Ozawa's decoy carriers appeared to the north, exactly where Japanese planning had intended them to appear, as bait for an aggressive commander who had been given permission to hunt. So the great American striking fleet turned north. Not part of it, all of it. That single movement, clean on a chart, left a gap behind that the Japanese had crossed an ocean to find. While Halsey drove toward Ozawa, the American beachhead kept unloading, and the old commanders closer to Leyte had to prepare for the battle that might arrive through darkness. On the afternoon of October 24th, Kinkaid came aboard Nashville to meet with MacArthur. Nashville was not some glamorous symbol ship alone. She was a useful light cruiser, experienced, armed, fast enough to matter, and sitting at anchor because she carried the supreme commander of the Southwest Pacific. Southward, Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf was arranging one of the most methodical ambushes in naval history. He had 6 pre-war battleships: West Virginia, Maryland, Mississippi, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania. 5 of those names carried the memory of Pearl Harbor in their steel. California and West Virginia had been sunk there, raised, repaired, and modernized. Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Tennessee had been damaged and restored. Now they waited in the dark, backed by 4 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, 21 destroyers, and 39 patrol torpedo boats. To the Japanese, Surigao Strait was an avenue into the anchorage. To Oldendorf, it was a funnel. The men on Nashville could see only the flashes in the distance. But what they were watching was the old battle line of the United States Navy, once humiliated in shallow harbor, now drawn across a narrow strait to settle accounts in a fashion almost antique. It was the last great battleship against battleship action of the war, and it was not fought for abstract honor. It was fought to keep Nishimura from reaching the transports and turning Leyte Gulf into a slaughter pen. There is an undercover detail in that night that tells you more about MacArthur than either worship or contempt usually allows. According to later recollection, Kincaid did not want to carry MacArthur into a night surface battle. MacArthur did not want the appearance of avoiding danger. The result was that he stayed aboard Nashville while Surigao thundered roughly 40 miles to the south. Men in the dark listened to the radios and watched the horizon. The general spent the night in the flag cabin of a cruiser that was itself being withheld from immediate use because he was on it. That sounds almost trivial until you place it beside the problem that would arrive with daylight. Surigao ended in American success. Oldendorf's force shattered Nishimura's column. But success in one choke point did not close the other. During the night, Kurita had passed through San Bernardino Strait. The trap the Japanese had designed was broken in one jaw and still open in the other. At dawn on October 25th, the crisis became unmistakable. East of Samar, just after sunrise, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's Task Group 77.4.3, known forever as Taffy 3, found itself staring at a nightmare. This was not a battle fleet. It was 6 small escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts, assigned to provide close air support and anti-submarine protection for the amphibious landings. Against them came Kurita's center force, 23 warships in all, 4 battleships including Yamato with her 18-inch guns, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. This was the northern hammer of Sho-1, finally falling where it had been meant to fall all along, toward the frail screen guarding the routes to the transports and supply ships off Leyte. The Japanese had every reason to think the moment had arrived. Halsey was away. The southern force had at least drawn blood and confusion before being destroyed. The beachhead still depended on the sea. Somewhere ahead, behind the escort carriers, lay the anchorage and the cargo nets, and the Army's unfinished landing. Then came the flash message to Nashville. MacArthur was requested to leave immediately. The cruiser, heavy with fuel and ammunition, was urgently needed outside the Gulf to help repel the Japanese force attacking the jeep carriers and threatening the invasion fleet. Here, in the most direct answer to the title, is what MacArthur did. He and his staff left the ship promptly. No speech, no tableau, no refusal designed for legend. He got off. Nashville weighed anchor and ran out at flank speed, about 28 knots, to rejoin the fight. It still took more than 2 hours. By the time she reached the area, the decisive phase had already passed. But that does not diminish the meaning of the act. In the middle of a trap, MacArthur did not cling to the prestige of his flagship. He released it. One more cruiser went back into circulation for the defense of the beachhead. That is not the romantic answer many expect. It is the administrative answer of a commander who understands that ships are not pedestals. They are tools. And in a battle about logistics, the plain decision to stop tying up a useful tool mattered. Out east of Samar, meanwhile, plain tools were performing miracles. Sprague's little carriers ran for weather and smoke, launching every aircraft that could fly, whether armed for anti-ship work or not. Their destroyers and destroyer escorts laid smoke, charged into shellfire, and attacked with a savagery that made the Japanese lose their grip on what they were seeing. Johnston, Heerman, and Hole went in first. Samuel B. Roberts joined them, with Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond following in individual attacks. These were not gestures. They were timed acts of violence by small ships against overwhelmingly larger opponents, meant to bend formation, spoil aim, force course changes, and buy minutes. One torpedo from Johnston damaged the heavy cruiser Kumano. Shellfire tore into the American escorts. Hole was hammered early and kept fighting. Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort, fought beyond the scale of her design. Above them, The aircraft of Taffy 3 kept returning with whatever they had. Bombs, rockets, machine gun fire, even empty intimidation when there was nothing else left. And it was not only Taffy 3. Aircraft from Taffy 2, from escort carriers such as Natoma Bay, Manila Bay, Marcus Island, Kadashan Bay, Savo Island, and Omani Bay, also struck at Kurita's ships again and again. That is one of the underappreciated features of the morning. The Japanese had plotted an elegant pincer. The Americans answered with a crowded, improvised, almost democratic violence. Every available deck, every pilot, every destroyer captain, every radio operator, every ship that could still move contributing something to the delay. The cargo net was still swaying behind them because small men in small ships refused to accept the arithmetic. Kurita had expected support from Japanese airfields on Luzon. He did not receive it. He had expected, after the damage of the previous day, to fight disorganized remnants. Instead, he encountered an enemy that behaved as though a full carrier force lurked just beyond the smoke. Part of that illusion came from the aggressiveness of the American escorts. Part came from the continuing air attacks. Part came from the divided and confused picture on the Japanese side. As the battle wore on, Kurita's situational awareness frayed. His scout capability suffered. His line lost coherence. Some of his ships pursued the carriers while others dealt with torpedo attacks and airstrikes. He was winning tactically in flashes. American ships were burning and sinking. But strategically he was being denied the one thing Sho-Go required, a clear run into the anchorage. The Japanese High Command had imagined the invasion fleet pinned like prey. Instead, the prey kept dissolving into smoke and stinging from every direction. This is where the material depth of the American war effort begins to show its real face. It is easy to remember Leyte Gulf as a clash of famous names: Halsey, Kurita, MacArthur, Oldendorf. But the American answer to the trap was structural. 5 of Oldendorf's 6 battleships had already been through Pearl Harbor and returned to service. The escort carriers off Samar were small, slow, and built for work rather than glory. Yet there were enough of them to sustain close air support and still launch repeated attacks in crisis. Even the command failure, serious as it was, did not completely undo the breadth of the system beneath it. Radios carried warnings, even when delay and overload clouded them. Submarines had already cut down Kurita's strength before he reached the battlefield. Carrier aircraft had sunk Musashi. Oldendorf had destroyed the southern thrust. Nashville, once released by MacArthur, could race to support the eastern crisis. In the anchorage and on the beaches, unloading had already put ashore the beginnings of an army that could not be erased by one raid unless the Japanese actually entered the Gulf and stayed there. Halsey later believed Kurita could only strike and run, not reverse the invasion. That judgment remains controversial because the danger was very real. But the point is that by October 25th, American strength at Leyte was not a brittle line. It was becoming a layered fact. The Japanese had arrived one campaign too late against an enemy that could take punishment in one sector and still answer in 3 others. Even so, the morning did not feel inevitable to the men under fire. Escort carrier Gambier Bay was lost. The destroyers Hole and Johnston were lost. Samuel B. Roberts was lost. Shell splashes rose among thin-skinned carriers built to escort convoys, not dual battleships. The bridge crews of the Japanese heavy ships could actually see the prey they had been promised. Somewhere behind those carriers lay the transport area and the beachhead. If Kurita had pressed in with full clarity, the story of Leyte might read very differently. That is why the morning remained so unsettling. American victory did not emerge from elegance. It emerged from confusion endured better than the other side. Kurita at last turned away. The reasons still invite debate, but the evidence points to several things acting together. He had been attacked without pause from sea and air. He believed he was facing a much larger carrier force than he really was. He lacked the air cover he had counted on. His formation had been disordered. And the violent resistance of ships that should have fled convinced him that the waters ahead concealed more strength than they did. In the simplest sense, Taffy 3 and its supporting aircraft made the Japanese admiral doubt his own success. That doubt saved the beachhead. While the eastern crisis ebbed, Halsey was far to the north battering Ozawa's decoy force. There, the fast carriers achieved what they had been sent to do in spirit, if not in strategic priority. The Japanese carrier Zuikaku, the last surviving fleet carrier from Pearl Harbor, was sunk. Light carriers Zuiho and Chitose were sunk as well, along with the destroyer Akizuki. It was a victory, but one purchased at the price of leaving Samar exposed. The decoy had worked. Here again the Japanese plan half succeeded and wholly failed. Ozawa had drawn Halsey off, but Kurita could not convert that opening into the destruction of the anchorage. In operational history, failure often looks like this. One arm of a plan arriving brilliantly while another cannot capitalize. In sleepier language, it is like a door swinging wide into an empty room, because the house beyond it has more hallways than the intruder understood. And there was one more wound yet to come. Near mid-morning, after the surface battle off Samar had already turned, kamikaze aircraft struck Taffy 3. Kitkun Bay, Fanshawe Bay, and White Plains drove off or shot down attackers. But Callinan Bay and St. Lo were hit, St. Lo fatally, becoming the first major ship sunk by a Japanese suicide attack. That small escort carrier, one of the modest workhorses built to extend American reach, vanished in smoke and fire after helping save the invasion. Her loss is a harsh postscript to any triumphant account. Even as the trap failed, war was learning new ways to become intimate and irreversible. Men who had survived battleship gunfire were now dying because another man had flown his own body into their deck. By the time Nashville came racing out, the great hinge of the morning had already turned. Kurita was withdrawing. The jeep carriers and their escorts, at terrible cost, had denied him the path to the transports. Oldendorf had already broken the southern jaw of the pincer. Halsey was destroying the decoy carriers in the north. From the viewpoint of a map, the Japanese admirals had reached the point of maximum opportunity and then lost their grasp on the object. From the viewpoint of MacArthur's campaign, what mattered most was that the invasion fleet still existed and the build-up on Leyte would continue. That is why the image worth keeping is not only Yamato's giant guns or the flash of broadsides in Surigao. It is the cargo net, still lowering crates into waiting hands. The Japanese had come to kill a landing while it was still becoming an army. They found, instead, an American style of war that had already spread itself into too many forms to be severed by one stroke. If you look at MacArthur's role through that lens, it becomes both less glamorous and more serious. He did not win Leyte Gulf by personal nautical genius. He was not the man maneuvering destroyers off Samar or placing the old battle line across Surigao Strait. The fighting credit belongs where it was earned. To Oldendorf, Sprague, Kincaid's sailors, the submarine crews, the pilots, the destroyermen, the airmen from the escort carriers, and the anonymous beach parties who kept the shore connected to the sea. But MacArthur's presence at Leyte mattered because Leyte itself mattered. And when the crisis came for Nashville, he did not turn a warship into a shrine for his own safety or prestige. He vacated it so it could fight. He remained the political and strategic center of the campaign while allowing the naval instrument under him or near him to become fully a weapon again. That is a smaller, plainer kind of command than legend usually celebrates. It is also often the more useful kind. There is another irony buried in the battle. The Japanese had built Sho-1 on the old dream of the decisive fleet engagement, the sudden concentration that would reverse decline through one shattering act. The Americans, despite having more ships and planes, did not actually survive Leyte by executing one perfect centralized idea. They survived because their power was distributed. It lived in those Pearl Harbor battleships restored to service. It lived in the escort carriers deemed too humble for the glamorous naval histories. It lived in the submarines waiting at dawn. It lived in the guerrilla radios that had helped set the operation in motion. It lived in command relationships that were flawed, yes, but still sat atop a material abundance the Japanese could no longer match. It lived in the ability to lose a carrier in the north, a carrier in the east, cruisers and destroyers elsewhere, and still continue the invasion. That is the industrial truth so many dramatic retellings blur. Freedom, when it survives modern war, often survives because it can build redundancies. Democracy at its most practical is not a speech on a beach. It is 1,000 separate capacities that keep working after the first blow lands. By the end of October, the Japanese Navy had spent much of its remaining strength and gained almost nothing lasting. Leyte was not saved because fate favored one side. It was saved because the American side had made itself dense. Dense with ships, dense with fuel, dense with radios, dense with pilots, dense with repaired hulls that had already been sunk once and come back, dense with cargo and engineers and all the dull labor that turns an invasion from a gamble into a fact. The recurring miracle of the Pacific War is how often victory looked mechanical before it looked heroic. Men still had to die for it. They died terribly off Samar and in the waters of Surigao and in the burning wreck of St. Lo. But their courage was not floating alone. It was fastened to architecture, to yards and depots and dry docks and assembly lines and classrooms and code rooms and farmers and welders and clerks and riflemen and coxswains and machinists. The cargo net again. Rope and knots, wet with spray, lowering one more load. If it seems too humble an emblem for the salvation of MacArthur's invasion fleet, that is exactly why it works. Admirals may imagine decisive enclosures and generals may give history its memorable silhouettes, but real victory usually enters by rope, crate, fuel hose, dispatch, bearing, and repair plate. On that wet night and raw morning at Leyte, the Japanese admirals thought they had trapped an invasion fleet. For a few hours they were not wrong to think so. The opening was real. The beachhead was vulnerable. The escort carriers east of Samar were terribly alone. And yet the trap failed because what lay inside it was not merely a cluster of ships. It was a civilization that had learned how to fight through layers. When one layer bent, another answered. When one ship had to be released, MacArthur stepped off it. When one strait had to be held, the resurrected battle line held it. When one screen had to die buying time, Taffy 3 died buying time. When one great Japanese force came on believing it had found prey, it instead found smoke, aircraft, torpedoes, misinformation, and a stubborn web of resistance that made success look larger and farther away with every passing minute. That is the larger truth Leyte leaves behind. Freedom in war is not secured only by the men who destroy. It is secured by the men who build enough structure that destruction arrives too late. The Japanese brought superb ships and a plan of converging blades. The Americans answered with an ugly, sprawling, resilient architecture. In the end, the sea around Leyte did not belong to the admiral who imagined the cleanest trap. It belonged to the side whose cargo nets kept moving. And long after the gun flashes died in Surigao, long after the smoke off Samar thinned and drifted into the noon sky, that plain image remained. Rope descending from a transport in the rain. One more load swinging toward the shore, as if the Republic itself had decided that true victory would not be announced by the loudest explosion, but by the quiet continuation of work.